Human civilization has been driven by two powerful forces. One is practical interests, and the other is moral passion. When a nation can successfully merge these two forces, it demonstrates remarkable unity and vitality. Therefore, British colonialists portrayed their invasions as advanced races, rescuing backward races. Meanwhile, the United States justified the Cold War to its citizens by frequently depicting us Soviet confrontation as a battle between justice and evil, America and Satan. The advantage of this approach was its highly efficient mobilization, which enabled the public to quickly establish who were enemies and who were friends. After decades of Cold War, the United States was extremely successful in shaping social consensus. A very vivid example is that, even today, the most serious accusation against an American politician isn't corruption or abuse of power, but that they're promoting communism. However, this approach of moral condemnation also brings negative consequences. If something aligns with national interests, but contradicts previous moral propaganda, its advancement faces tremendous resistance. In 1968, due to prolonged failure in the Vietnam War, America's expansionist policy of relying solely on military force suffered major setbacks. The ruling Democratic administration was consequently abandoned by voters. Newly elected Republican President Nixon needed to establish a new Cold War policy. He faced two domestic conditions at this time. First, while the military could pressure politicians without restraint, it couldn't ignore internal pressure from massive casualties. Even hardline generals had to admit that previous policies needed changing, which was good news for Nixon. But simultaneously, Nixon faced an unfavorable condition. After prolonged propaganda, communism had been completely stigmatized in America, where any cooperation or compromise with communist nations drew accusations, greatly limiting the White House's diplomatic options. What few Chinese people know is that Nixon himself actually launched his political career with an extreme anti-communist stance. Thus, a significant yet crucial question emerged, wondering how this president managed to overcome the strong political inertia domestically by establishing diplomatic relations with the new China, completely reversing America's passive situation in Asia, and laying a solid foundation for America's eventual victory in the Cold War. On June 26, 1945, President Truman addressed the first United Nations conference in San Francisco, California. At that moment, a senior U.S. government official named Alger Hiss sat at the far right of the podium. His public role then was Secretary General of the UN Conference on International Organization, and he had previously served as a member of the U.S. delegation to the Yalta Conference, later becoming director of the State Department's Office of Special Political Affairs. No one could have imagined that such a high-ranking U.S. official was actually a Soviet spy, who would be exposed and convicted 2 years later by a young congressman named Richard Nixon. However, in 1945, Nixon was still serving in the Navy in Baltimore, using his legal background to handle contract matters for the military. At that time, a letter changed Nixon's life. It turned out that California's 12th congressional district was predominantly Republican, but due to internal Republican conflicts, the seat had long been held by Democratic Congressman Jerry Voorhis. To change this situation, the Republicans formed a committee of 100 and sought promising candidates, with an old friend encouraging Nixon to pursue this opportunity in the letter. Meanwhile, Walter Dexter, former president of Nixon's alma mater Whittier College, also recommended him to the committee. Therefore, Nixon left the Navy and conducted an intensive year-long campaign where his legal experience, Navy service experience, and exceptional debating skills quickly demonstrated Nixon's qualities as an exceptional politician. Moreover, during his first election campaign, Nixon attacked his Democratic opponent Voorhis for alleged ties to a communist organization, which proved highly effective. In 1946, Nixon defeated Voorhis and was successfully elected to Congress. Emboldened by this success, Nixon joined the House Un-American Activities Committee in late 1947. This committee specifically investigated organizations, citizens, and public officials suspected of espionage or communist affiliations. It was during this period that Nixon led the investigation into the sensational Alger Hiss spy case. Since Alger Hiss was a well-educated senior government official, he didn't fit the public's image of a spy. This case had significant influence in the United States. The famous anti-American spy case caused quite a shock among the British, and it also thrust Nixon into the public spotlight. Thanks to the case's influence, Nixon served only 4 years as a congressman before successfully entering the Senate, and 2 years later was chosen by Eisenhower as America's vice president, thus entering politics within just 6 years. This Navy lieutenant who worked in administration rose through anti-communism to become the second most powerful figure in the White House. One reason Eisenhower chose Nixon as his running mate was to have him do the dirty work in presidential campaigns, specifically digging up dirt on opponents and then smearing their reputations. Nixon excelled at these tasks and thus earned Eisenhower's appreciation. Eisenhower gave Nixon considerable authority, even allowing him to preside over Cabinet and National Security Council meetings during his absences. However, although Nixon personally gained great benefits from anti-communism, he remained an ultimate pragmatist at heart. He wasn't attached to any particular ideology, meaning he merely used anti-communism as a tool to gain political power, not out of any genuine belief. If pro-communism could achieve the same goal, he wouldn't hesitate to embrace it either. In fact, we often observe this seemingly contradictory phenomenon among many self-made American politicians. Lacking political background and resources, they often need to pose as fervent ideological believers to gain political capital. But, deep down, they're ultimate pragmatists who feel no psychological burden when making decisions that violate ideological lines. This characteristic became even more pronounced when Nixon prepared to run for president. In the 1968 U.S. election, the Democrats became deeply divided over Vietnam War failures, giving Republicans a significant advantage. Therefore, the Democratic administration sent envoys for secret negotiations with Vietnam, hoping to reach a ceasefire agreement before the election and help Democratic candidate Hubert Humphrey regain public support. Meanwhile, Nixon, as the Republican presidential candidate, also hinted to the media that he had a secret plan to achieve honorable peace in Vietnam. But in reality, Nixon not only had no plan at this point, but was also secretly sabotaging the incumbent Democratic administration's efforts to reach a ceasefire agreement in Vietnam. In May 1968, Harriman, the widely respected Democratic Party elder statesman on foreign policy, engaged with the Vietnamese side in Paris on behalf of the U.S. government to discuss ceasefire terms. Around the same time, Nixon enlisted Anna Chennault, the widow of General Claire Lee Chennault, to contact the South Vietnamese government, urging them to take a hardline stance and sabotage the peace talks, while promising that a Republican administration would offer South Vietnam more favorable peace terms. Meanwhile, another key figure, Harvard political science professor Henry Kissinger, also entered the scene. Kissinger had originally been the foreign policy advisor to another Republican presidential candidate, Nelson Rockefeller, and he long believed the U.S. should end the Vietnam War. At that time, Nixon maintained a staunchly hardline anti-communist stance. Kissinger believed that, of all the candidates, he was the one least likely to compromise with North Vietnam. He therefore called Nixon the most dangerous candidate in the election. When Nixon defeated Rockefeller to become the Republican presidential nominee, Kissinger was deeply dismayed. However, after learning more about Nixon, he quickly realized Nixon wasn't someone obsessed with slogans, but was merely using anti-communism as a convenient political tool. So, Kissinger contacted Nixon's campaign, offering to do anything he could to help Nixon win. The first thing he did was to spy on the Democratic administration's progress in the Vietnam peace talks for Nixon. On September 17, 1968, Kissinger wrote a letter to the Democratic administration's chief negotiator, Harriman, claiming he had broken with the Republican Party and hoped to contribute his expertise to the peace talks. Subsequently, Kissinger met with Harriman in Paris, and probed for details on the talks' progress by conversing with staff. In this way, Nixon was able to stay informed about the Paris peace talks, while simultaneously urging the South Vietnamese government to sabotage them. On October 30th, the South Vietnamese peace delegation unilaterally announced its withdrawal from the negotiations, not returning to Paris until January of the following year. However, by that time, the U.S. election had long been over. Nixon ultimately defeated his Democratic rival, Hubert Humphrey, by a razor-thin margin of 0.7%. Had the Democratic administration been able to secure a peace agreement before the election, the outcome of that year's election might indeed have been different. But history does not deal in what-ifs. Nixon, through his ruthless methods, finally ascended to the presidency with his advisors' help. Kissinger, who assisted him in achieving this, received a generous reward, becoming Nixon's national security advisor. This political duo, which would alter the course of American and world history, had officially made their debut. From a certain perspective, they were a perfect match. They were similar yet complementary in many ways, such as both rising from humble beginnings to reach the pinnacle of American power. Consequently, they both adhered to extreme pragmatism, carrying little ideological baggage, while desperately craving recognition and yearning to achieve something groundbreaking. On the other hand, Kissinger provided the expertise and strategic vision Nixon lacked, while Nixon's political cunning ensured Kissinger could safely advance his agenda. Thus, two equally calculating, ambitious pragmatists began making their mark on the world stage. The 1972 presidential election was one of the least competitive in American history. From start to finish, Nixon maintained a lead in the polls. He achieved 60.7% of the popular vote, setting a Republican record for the largest share, and easily secured re-election. Nixon's domestic popularity stemmed from America learning one crucial lesson under his leadership. Even as the world's most powerful nation, America should assess situations carefully and learn to engage with diverse forces, rather than launching crusades like against infidels. This approach of shaping foreign policy based on real power dynamics constitutes a realist diplomatic style. Its opposite involves guiding foreign policy purely by moral principles or values. Nixon and Kissinger were precisely the types who valued practical outcomes and disliked emphasizing morality and values in rhetoric. Moreover, with American forces facing enormous difficulties in Vietnam, they had sufficient reason to discard any remaining moral fervor. When Nixon first took office, the U.S. had deployed over 500,000 troops in Southeast Asia, with an average of 300 American soldiers dying weekly in Vietnam's jungles. Such a costly war was neither sustainable nor widely accepted within American society. However, if America admitted defeat and abruptly withdrew from Vietnam, it would severely damage the president's reputation. Nixon needed to find an arrangement that would allow us troops to withdraw while preventing the South Vietnamese government from collapsing, at least not during his term in office. Therefore, Nixon proposed a strategy of Vietnamization, which involved training and equipping South Vietnamese forces to play a larger role in the war and replace American troops on the battlefield. Later, Nixon extended this strategy of providing weapons, but no direct involvement to the Middle East. This approach became known as the Nixon Doctrine, which continues to influence us foreign policy today. At the end of 1969, Nixon began phased troop withdrawals from Vietnam, earning significant public approval. But at the same time, he recognized that, for us forces to withdraw from Vietnam honorably, America needed to accept compromise with other major powers and reduce North Vietnam's ability to receive external aid. Therefore, from his first day in the White House, Nixon worked to open communication channels with the new China in July 1971. Kissinger secretly arrived in Beijing while visiting Pakistan. The following February, Nixon visited China as planned, becoming the first US president to visit the new China while in office. Using this as leverage, America also promoted detente with the Soviet Union, facilitating US-Soviet summits making Nixon the first US president to visit Moscow. That year, America finally withdrew most military forces from Vietnam, laying the foundation for Nixon's landslide victory in 1972. Examining how the Nixon administration achieved these remarkable feats reveals that this was less the meticulous design of a cunning genius and strategic mastermind, and more like a leader facing difficulties, finding solutions naturally while tackling immediate challenges step by step. Each of these decisions presented no intellectual difficulty. The challenge was abandoning stereotypes formed by long-term hostile propaganda, unrealistic demands, and the arrogance of believing in divine entitlement. Of course, Nixon was by no means a benevolent figure either. The bombing of Cambodia, overthrowing Chile's democratically elected President Allende, and enabling the Argentine military junta's reign of terror. When facing weaker nations that couldn't fight back, the Nixon administration showed no mercy whatsoever. But before America took these actions, could it fabricate a noble justification? For these invaded countries, it made no fundamental difference. In reality, throughout human history, God's most devout followers have often wielded their blades against the weak, while deceitful devils, when confronted with equal power, are forced to keep their promises. Ironically, Nixon, the ultimate pragmatist, ultimately fell to moral judgment. On August 9, 1974, due to the Watergate scandal's impact, Nixon resigned from the presidency, and his successor Ford largely continued Nixon's policies. The following April, Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, fell. The prolonged Vietnam War finally reached its formal conclusion, and the Ford administration accepted this outcome quite calmly. However, no one could have predicted that Nixon's original series of decisions to resolve the Vietnam withdrawal would create unexpected chemical reactions. World affairs began rapidly evolving along a path nobody had anticipated.